Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to see you here. We have our two of our speakers on Zoom. I don't know if they can, I'm looking at them. I don't know if they see that I'm looking at them, but hello, Corinne. Hello, Heath. It's very good to have you here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Bose. I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy, and Public Service Programs, and the Director of the Calico Center for the Study of the American Presidency in the Peter S. Calico School of Government, Public Policy, and International Affairs. I am delighted to welcome you here today for our panel on how modern vice presidents influence presidential campaigns and White House policymaking. Now, you would say, why is the Center for the Study of the American Presidency, which is co-hosting with the Department of Political Science, hosting an event on the vice presidency? Well, we have multiple reasons for doing so, not least of which there is a forthcoming edited volume titled Second in Command, Reevaluating the Role of Vice Presidents and Running Mates in Modern American Politics. I am truly delighted that several of the participants, the contributors to this volume, have taken the time to join us at Hofstra today for this panel discussion. And as you know, we've had, if you're from the area, you know that we've had quite a week with weather, and I'm delighted to report that everyone made it. And so we are very excited to speak with you about the research in this book, which will be published later this spring. Because we have so many speakers today, and we want to maximize time for their discussions and your questions, my opening remarks are going to be very brief. I would like to thank the three classes and the professors who've taken the time to join us today. Dr. Feldman's American Politics course, Dr. Miller's Writing Studies course, and my Public Policy and Public Service course. I'd also like to recognize a member of our Calico School External Advisory Council, Mr. Michael Lucevero, who's taken the time to join us today, also a Hofstra alum. Used to sit here as a student, now sits as an advisory council member, so it's good to have you here, Michael. And I hope you will just indulge me in thanking, for a moment, our wonderful Cultural Center team, led by Miss Athleen Collins, who I hope won't leave while I say this. Our Cultural Center team makes every event possible. They have truly moved mountains to make this event happen. Not literally moving snow, but doing just about everything else. And so please join me in thanking Ms. Collins and her entire team for making this possible. Because we literally, our speakers would not be here without her. And so that is much appreciated. Now, what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it over to two of our panelists who are co-editors of the volume in a moment. And so what I will do is just briefly introduce our speakers. I'm not actually going to give, as I said, I'm not going to give formal evaluations. They are all highly distinguished scholars, authors, contributors to the policymaking process, and you can look them all up online. But let me just begin by introducing them, and then I'll turn it over for a discussion. The two co-editors of the volume Second in Command, for which I am truly honored to have written the introduction for, and this was a project that started about 3 years ago, I think, almost 4 years ago, are Professor Corinne Primont, who is on Zoom from the University of Sherbrooke in Montreal. And Professor Primont has a very good reason for not being able to travel here, and it was not weather related. She is the recipient of a teaching award from her university and was there to accept the award. Congratulations, Corinne. It is wonderful to see you on the Zoom and to congratulate you directly. The other co-editor of the book is Dr. Christopher Devine from the University of Dayton, who is an expert on presidential elections, and also for this volume has written on vice presidential selection. And I should have said that Dr. Primont has written about the vice presidents and different types of governance. Also joining us on the panel we're very fortunate to have 5 distinguished contributors to the panel with us today. I will go in the order of their chapters. So, and actually sitting right next to me is Professor Roy Brownell, who has written about the vice presidency and checks and balances. Mr. Brownell has a distinguished career in public service and also in academia, teaches at Georgetown Law Center, has worked in the State Department, worked in the U.S. Senate as Chief of Staff for Senator Mitch McConnell, and has held a number of other positions, has written extensively about separation of powers, and in this volume writes about the vice presidency and checks and balances. Professor Jody Baumgartner, two over to my right, is a professor of political science at East Carolina University. He has written extensively about vice presidential selection and vice presidential humor. And so I think you'll find, not surprisingly, the title of his chapter is Vice Presidents Don't Get No Respect. Jody, we're delighted to welcome you here today. Thank you. Our two speakers at either ends of the table have co-written a chapter on assessing vice presidents of the United States. Professor Brandon Rottinghouse of the University of Houston has published about presidential communication and legislative policymaking and multiple other subjects. Also, I believe, is pretty active in with a podcast on Texas politics, if I'm correct. And so we're delighted to welcome you here, Brandon. Professor Justin Vaughn of Coastal Carolina University has written about presidential advisors. A book came out about a decade ago titled Presidential Czars. This is a return trip to Hofstra, was here for our presidential conference on the George W. Bush presidency. And Professors Rottinghouse and Vaughn are, you may have seen them in the news in 2024. They authored a survey of academics on presidential greatness, and this got quite a bit of attention. This was the third iteration of their survey. And for this volume, they had included a section on assessing vice presidents. So it is a pleasure to have both of you here. Thank you. And then also joining us on Zoom is Professor Heath Brown of the City College of New York. Heath, it is wonderful to have you join us today. Professor Brown published a book about a year and a half ago on the transfer of power and presidential transitions. And for this volume, he has contributed a very instructive chapter on vice presidents-elect during the transfer of power. And we're so glad that you're able to join us, Heath. Thank you for being here. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Professors Premont and Devine to introduce the volume, and we'll have the contributors will share their findings. We'll have a little discussion, and we're going to leave plenty of room for student questions. So thank you. Please, Chris and Corinne.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Just so you know, the University of Sherbrooke is a French-Canadian university, so hence the accent. First, I want to thank Mina, Atheline, and everyone who helped organize the symposium, as well as Hofstra University, of course, for giving us this space to talk about the vice presidency and to present second in command. The idea for this edited volume came, to be honest, out of a bit of frustration. I was getting tired of hearing colleagues say that everything had already been written about the vice presidency, or that it was impossible to look at it academically because it was too tied to the personalities of presidents and vice presidents. Those comments really bothered me because they did not reflect the innovative work of many scholars on how running mates were chosen, how they are covered by the media, or when and how vice presidents can influence their administration's policies, for example. So after a panel on running mates and vice presidents at the American Political Science Association conference in Montreal in 2022, Chris and I started talking about putting together an edited volume. We wanted to showcase the diversity and richness of the perspectives shared by the scholars who took part in that panel, among which Richard and Reb, as well as many others. I think Second in Command really captures that spirit, and I hope you will see that throughout the symposium. I am truly grateful to have had the chance to work with Chris on this project, and just as grateful to all the distinguished experts who contributed to the book with such enthusiasm. Again, thank you for having us. I will now hand it over to Chris and the panelists. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Corinne.
Thank you very much, Corinne. That was a wonderful introduction, and I echo the thanks to Mina, to Dr. Bose, to Atheline, to so many others who contributed to making this event possible, to contributors, panelists who have joined us here in person or on Zoom. And it's just such a great opportunity to be able to celebrate this. I don't know how interested you are in the vice presidency just naturally, but it is part of this broader study of the presidency. I think while surely vice presidents are not as important as the president, I don't think any of us would argue otherwise. We have an incomplete understanding of the presidency of the United States if we don't take into account VPs and what they do, and especially how that's changed over time and how that changes from administration to administration across various circumstances and so forth. Now, just to give you a quick sense of this book, this is what we call an edited volume. When I was an undergraduate college student, I might not know what that is, so I'll explain it. So this is something where instead of one person or two people maybe writing an entire book together, instead they're basically bringing together people to contribute a chapter each. And so Primont wrote one chapter herself. I have a chapter with Kyle Kopko, my frequent co-author on all things VP. And then we had others where Corinne and I kind of started off thinking, what would be the topics we'd love to cover? Like if we want to really capture the vice presidency these days and how things have changed, what are some things that have to be in there? And then figure who could write that chapter and see if they'd be willing to do so. And we were so pleased by the responses we got from people who have expertise in these areas or people who hadn't been writing about vice presidents but had some very relevant research they could extend in that direction. And, sometimes what we were doing was asking folks to keep what you're doing is great. Can you give us more on this? And so turning to Richard Yan to give us some more depth on national security matters in the vice president's role in that. Or Stacey Ulbig is someone who does wonderful research on vice presidential candidates and media coverage of them. Had a great book on that over 10 years ago. Hey, could you update that? Kyle Kopko and I did a similar update about the effect of vice presidential candidates on elections. In other cases, we were asking people to take a new spin on things that they've done before. So Professor Baumgartner next to me, who has done wonderful work on the vice presidency and on political humor. We asked, could you bring those things together and do something on VPs and political humor, which was fascinating. Others, Chuck Holden, who did some wonderful, was co-author of a wonderful book on Spiro Agnew, a former vice president, asking him to look at the attack dog role that was associated with VPs broadly, but especially with Spiro Agnew in that case. And we had others, as Heath's book on presidential transitions, asking him to look specifically at the VP's role in that, or with Brandon and Justin, their presidential greatness study, extending that to measures of VP greatness. So there's just a lot of ground that we've covered here with the help of our friends who agreed to contribute, and we're so grateful for that. And what I want to say about that, just in wrapping up, is kind of echoing some things that Corinne was just speaking to. There's kind of a community of people who study these things, who study VPs, but we don't often work together on it. There's an article here, a book there, or something like that. It's just been a great opportunity to acknowledge, hey, we're doing things in this same area that, as you just heard, aren't always appreciated for the scholarship that they are. And so we wanted to have a place where we could gather them together in one book, or in this case, physically in one room, or also on Zoom, and say, this is a group of people who are studying this. Let's kind of draw on each other and really unpack all the different aspects of VPs and running mates that could be important. So I hope that you'll learn something about it and appreciate the importance of this, especially as we go into the next election. You start thinking about electing the next VP. Who should they pick? Who should you elect? This is consequential, and I hope we're able to help explain why that is today.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So now I think we'll move into the presentations of the chapters. Corinne, are you going to begin with, if we go chronologically? No, we'll go into, I wasn't sure if you were going to present your typology for a few minutes, or if we'll go directly to the other panelists. Yes, okay.
Well, you want me to present my chapter?
Or I guess you're going to share your screen, right, to show the table of contents?
Yeah. I'll try to.
All right, let's see if it works.
I practice, so. So just let me know if it's working.
It is. Okay, now we can't
It
see
is?
you or Heath, but we can see the screen.
No.
So that
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay.
Let me just say here too that this is the benefit of our newly designed room, is that we can have something on the screen and we can all be here. Previously, the screen would be behind us. So, Corinne and Chris, were you going to say a few words about the chapters, or should we just turn it over?
Yeah, I could say a word on this just quickly.
Yeah.
The book is broken into two parts. One thing we did very intentionally in this is having one half of it, 6 chapters, that are on the vice presidency, and then half of them, 6 chapters, on the running mates, because it's not the same thing. Someone who runs for vice president doesn't necessarily get it. Just ask Tim Walz, right? Sometimes they do, and they become a vice president, but we need to distinguish between those two things and see the different roles that they play. It's one thing to possibly help win an election. It's another thing to actually serve in office. So we wanted to make that distinction, and so we have 6 chapters on each of these things. Karina, is there anything you want to add about that, or do you want to tell us about your chapter?
I'm sorry, I tried to unmute at the same time. I can say a few words about my chapter, and then we can go to the other panelists if that's okay.
And I think, Corinne, you can stop sharing your screen for the moment because now we can't see you, and then we can just put it back on when Justin and Brandon need their slide. Yeah? Is
Okay.
that good? Yeah, thank you.
So in an earlier study, I developed the typology of partnerships between presidents and their vice presidents to understand not only the vice president's roles, but also the variation in their influence, both across different vice presidents, but also depending on the issue at stake or from one term to another. So there are weak partnerships, such as the communication partnership between George Bush and Nan Quayle, or the coordination partnership between Donald Trump and Mike Pence, for instance. But there are also strong partnerships like the cooperative partnership between Barack Obama and Joe Biden, or the collaborative partnership between George W. Bush and Richard Cheney. So in my chapter for Second in Command, I apply this typology to the case of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Although President Biden initially suggested that a strong partnership might emerge between them, what we have actually seen is that Vice President Harris has been largely confined to a coordination type partnership, which is a weak one. This can be explained by several factors, like the reasons why she was selected as Biden's running mate, the tasks she was assigned once in the White House, and the nature of a professional and personal relationship with the president and his inner circle. So, in brief, this chapter highlights the difficulties inherent to being the vice president to an experienced president who has already held that position himself. So that's what I was talking about in this chapter. So I'll let the other panelists present theirs.
Great. Thank you very much. And I should say, by the way, that if you're intrigued by all of these chapters and want to know more, we do have a flyer for the book that is available at the desk in the back. And am I allowed to say that the book will be available? The University of Michigan Press is publishing it. It will be available via open access. So when the book is published, you will be able to look at any of the chapters you'd like. So starting with Professor Primon's chapter on vice presidents and presidents, different types of partnerships. That leads us directly into the next chapter on the vice presidency in the constitutional system of checks and balances. So I'll turn it over to Professor Brownell.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Bose and Hofstra for hosting us today. My chapter is about the vice presidency and checks and balances, and basically what I get into is the question of, given the right circumstances, sometimes vice presidents are able and willing to exercise a check and a balance against the president, to basically, when the president is exercising overweening executive power and maybe getting a little bit ahead of his skis as to sort of what authority he has or should be exercising, that the vice president, in certain contexts, may view it in their own interest and also maybe in the broader national interest to attempt to check the president from taking this action. And there are a number of sort of case studies and categories that I considered in the chapter. The one and most obvious is Mike Pence defending Democratic elections and Democratic mores on January 6th, 2021, when President Trump tried to basically persuade him to take action that would have violated the existing statute and longstanding practice of what the vice president's role traditionally had been in the electoral vote count actions on January 6th. Mike Pence obviously declined, took action consistent with law and precedent, and in a sense helped really check the president, who was looking to take extreme and excessive and almost certainly unlawful action in this context. So that's sort of in the category of democratic elections. But there are other instances, too, that you may be less familiar with. So, for example, there's the defense of free speech. Thomas Jefferson was vice president as a Democratic Republican alongside a Federalist president in John Adams. The Federalist Congress had passed the Sedition Act, which basically criminalized dissent During this period, Thomas Jefferson worked sort of surreptitiously with two state legislatures to get resolutions passed to sort of publicize many of the dubious aspects of the Sedition Act, which later expired under their own terms. Jefferson's efforts also helped sort of propel him to election in 1801. And so in a sense, he may have been successful to some extent in checking maybe the long-term effects of the Sedition Act and maybe the way that it was implemented. Third category is protecting the judiciary. There are some precedents where the vice president has taken action to sort of help defend the judiciary against presidential incursions. There are two examples under the vice presidency of Aaron Burr, who was vice president with Thomas Jefferson during his first term. Burr basically worked to block, using his role as president of the Senate, to vote against and defeat an effort by the Jeffersonians to weaken the federal judiciary. In the long run, he was not successful, and the Jeffersonians, basically got their ducks in a row from a vote counting standpoint in the Senate and ultimately passed the measure. But Burr did take some efforts to try to moderate and to try to check some of the excesses of the Jeffersonians' attempt to weaken the judiciary. He did so in similar context in 1805 during the impeachment effort of Federalist Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase. The Jeffersonians very much wanted Burr to preside over that impeachment trial in the Senate in a very partisan way, which Burr declined to do, and ultimately Chase was acquitted. So again, in this context as well, you can see vice presidents taking effort, using their sort of formal powers as president of the Senate to try to check a president who was sort of, exceeding what I think most people would view as the bounds of realistic authority. And similar context, you have John Nance Garner in 1937, who performed sort of guerrilla activity in the legislative branch to sort of help defeat President Franklin Roosevelt's efforts to pack the courts in 1937 and expand the membership of the Supreme Court to drive it more to the left. Garner was able to sort of work quietly with senators to sort of subvert that effort, and in another example, to sort of essentially work to check the president. And a fourth category is defending term limits. Prior to the 22nd Amendment, which was adopted in the early 1950s, there was a customary two-term limit on the presidency. Ulysses Grant, however, was a two-term president and who was considering a third consecutive term. However, his vice president, Henry Wilson, worked in a sort of a very public way. He led sort of a public press campaign against Ulysses Grant pursuing a third term. Ultimately, he was successful in that not only Wilson, but his allies in this effort persuaded Grant that it was imprudent to pursue a third term at the time, which he did. Another example, again, is John Nance Garner in 1939 and 1940, who basically ran against Franklin D. Roosevelt when Roosevelt was considering a third term. Obviously, Garner was unsuccessful and did not pursue successfully the nomination. Franklin Roosevelt was renominated and elected to a third and then a fourth term. So these four categories sort of show ways where, given the right context, it's worth keeping in mind the vice president once in a while can be, or at least attempt to be, a check on presidential action. I would say these are somewhat rare given a number of considerations, but one of them is worth keeping in mind that, with the exception of Jefferson and Adams in these contexts, all these vice presidents and presidents were of the same party with one another. So a vice president countering a president is countering the leader of his own party, which is a very difficult position to be in. That said, it's worth keeping in mind, how often does a Congress of the same party as the president make an effort to sort of institutionally check that president on a major issue? And I think you'll find that those also tend to be fairly rare events as well. I'll conclude there and pass along, but looking forward to any questions.
Great. Thank you very much. We're going to actually shift a little bit now. We've been talking about the president and vice president as partners, and talked about just now about the vice president as part of the constitutional system of checks and balances, and how vice presidents can use their power to counter potentially presidential action with free speech, changes in the court system, the two-term limit, and protecting democratic principles. We're going to shift gears now to talking about how vice presidents are viewed by, let's say, the media, comedians, and then by scholars. So we'll start with Professor Baumgartner.
Let me first of all echo the thanks that we've heard thus far, and I anticipate hearing more of later for not only for having us here, but for the book project itself. Right? I'm always a little bit knocked over by the fact that I get asked to do this stuff. I don't know why. I just never really assume that it's that big of a deal, but thank you, really, from a personal perspective. The chapter I wrote focuses on caricatures of vice presidents that are propagated in mainstream political humor, primarily late-night television. It came about as the result of sort of marrying my two subfields. I actually specialize in political humor and the vice presidency. I had just finished a book, or was just finishing a book, maybe or something, while they were putting together this thing on political caricatures of modern politicians, say, in the television age. And so that's sort of what I focused on, the idea that, the central hook, right, that historically vice presidents and the vice presidency has been seen as something of a national joke. There's numerous instances of vice presidents putting the office down, of people refusing to run because they had a less than high opinion of the office. And so one might think, well, with the reality of the modern vice presidency, where vice presidents are now considered to be central players in their president's administration, that's probably changed a little bit, right? Well, no, wrong. That's not the case at all. To be fair, we don't have a very high opinion of any politician anymore, but that's probably a detail. So I was sort of looking at the irony of the fact that vice presidents are still viewed, and vice presidential candidates for that matter, are still viewed largely as something of a joke. What the chapter does is sort of goes through Vice Presidents Quayle. I sort of touch on Bush just a little bit, Vice President Bush. Quayle, Gore, Cheney, Biden, and Pence, and talk about what their caricature was. It's largely an idiosyncratic thing. There's no real trends evident unless one wants to get into the nature of humor itself. But in terms of political trends, it's not like, Democratic vice presidents were targeted in a certain way, then Republican vice presidents were targeted in another way. Nothing like that emerges whatsoever. In fact, with just 5, it's hard to identify any trend at all, so there isn't any. They're largely idiosyncratic. So I look at Vice President Quayle, who was viewed as something of a dunce, I guess is the most generous way to say it. Gore was seen as something of a stiff guy, right? Not really very relatable. Dick Cheney, I talk about Dick Cheney as Darth Vader, the sort of the evil presence, the evil overlord of American politics. Joe Biden is a gaffe machine, and Mike Pence is sort of a buttoned-up, straight-laced kind of guy. Not much by way of, not completely dissimilar from Gore, but even maybe less of a personality, really, in many respects. These caricatures are a product of, they're partially rooted in reality, partially. In some cases, they're more rooted in reality than, it's certainly the case that Al Gore, for example, was not necessarily the most natural politician ever born, right? Although he did get elected to other offices. Maybe Dan Quayle wasn't necessarily the top of his class, but he certainly wasn't necessarily a dunce, right? So they're partially based in reality. They're partially based in what journalists put together earlier on in the campaigns, usually, as a narrative with which they can tell a story about a presidential campaign, typically. These narratives sort of take root among the journalistic community and then eventually get picked up by late-night comics. And then it becomes a cycle, right? It's true enough so that the narrative makes at least a little bit of sense, and the narrative, even if it doesn't make a little bit of sense, and it usually does, the late-night comics pick up on it, and then it just reinforces the whole thing in our mind. And that's how we view things. So, and that's, I think, why it matters at the end of the day. My research on political humor suggests that exposure to political humor, being exposed to jokes about a certain politician, will eventually end up lowering one's perception or evaluation or attitude about that politician. That's not necessarily the case if the politician is well known, but at minimum, what it does is it reinforces these images in the minds of the public, right? I think that's where that's sort of the answer to the so what question, right? Why should we care about this stuff? I want to just take another quick second and just mention, by the by, I just finished a paper on the 2024 election and sort of how the Babylon Bee, a conservative Christian satire website, covered the election itself. And one of the big takeaways was they truly just completely lacerated Kamala Harris, quite predictably. It's a conservative Christian website. But it was hard to know, it was hard to identify any caricatures of Harris during her vice presidency because she was largely untouched by the late night comics. They just didn't make jokes about her. Well, the Babylon Bee did. And the idea that she was a word salad machine, that's the term that came out during the campaign. She speaks in word salads, just complete nonsense. The idea that she was responsible for, and therefore in many people's eyes, she was associated with, responsible for the perceived failures of the Biden administration, right? Some of this stuff came through. In fact, there's some really good stuff about Tim Walz as well, but I'm going to shut up for now and pass to the next person.
Thank you, Jay. You're leaving us lingering with questions to ask. All right. So we'll go from that, from humor to talking about presidential greatness. And I think, should I ask Corinne to put the slide up that the two of you had? If you would. Thank you, Corinne. And so Brandon and Justin.
Thank you, Dr. Bose, and thanks to all of you for coming here. I enjoyed my previous time at Hofstra and am enjoying this time as well. It's a very special place and a great place to study presidential politics. Dr. Rottinghouse and I have been doing this project for several years. In fact, the first survey that we did was published in 2015. And we've done 3 instances since then. And it was a real remarkable kind of fortuitous coincidence that around this time that we started talking about doing the 3rd iteration, which we released in 2020 or conducted in 2024, that Professor Devine had reached out to Professor Rottinghouse and said, "Hey, what do you guys think about doing something on the vice presidency?" And we said, "Well, why don't we put some questions in this new survey that we're about to do?" We did, and it came out really well. The Presidential Greatness Project, is what we call this ongoing series of surveys that we do, takes as an approach, our approach is to identify scholars of the American presidency and then send them an invitation to participate in a scientific survey that does a bunch of different things, but the main kind of bread and butter of it is has presidential experts rate, and then from those ratings we rank perceptions of greatness among presidency scholars of each of the U.S. presidents, and then we write analyses about who's up, who's down, why are some presidents reputationally increasing over time, why are some going down over time, but we and then we'll also embed a number of other interesting scholarly questions that we would like to investigate the answers to at particular moments in time. This time, we, as I mentioned, inserted some questions about the vice presidency. And so we sent this survey to over 500 scholars. We ended up having almost 200 respond and provide data that we could use to analyze it. Not every person answered every question, but our ratings that we're going to share with you in a moment are based on a pretty robust set of results from some experts in American politics, in particular presidential politics. In the section that we did about the vice presidency, we did a number of things. First of all, we wanted to understand how people identified vice presidential greatness. We're actually interested in how people define presidential greatness as well. But what does it mean to be a great vice president is a different and maybe in some ways even more interesting question. And so we included an open-ended question where respondents could type their answers in. We also had a question where based on the existing literature on vice presidential politics, we said, what do you think contributes the most to a great vice presidency? And we gave them a series of options, such as their ability to balance the ticket with the president who's running at the top of the ticket, their ability to act as a surrogate or a proxy for the president, their ability to maintain positive relations with the Congress for the administration, and their ability to serve as a policy advisor to the president. And from there, we got some pretty interesting information that was consistent with what we got from the open-ended results. But what it showed was that scholars particularly valued a vice president's ability to advise the president, followed by the vice president's ability to serve as a proxy for that president. So very institutional answers. They kind of give us some insights into what scholars today think about the American presidency and about the American vice presidency, and this really important ability for great presidents to not be the people who are making the big decisions or giving the heroic speeches, but rather the ones who are able to provide kind of a constitutional or systemic anchor when there's times of crisis, and so add to a sense of stability. Dr. Rottinghaus is going to talk about the more exciting information that we got out of the survey as well, but that gives you an idea of how we approached it and some of the big picture information we took away.
I got the long straw on this one, so I get to tell you about the fun results, but I want to say thank you for having us at Hofstra. It's my first time at Hofstra, my first time on Long Island, so not my first time seeing snow, although I am from Houston. I'm sure you're all sick of it by now, but I actually enjoy seeing it. So even campus is beautiful despite it. So thank you for that. As Justin said, we've been doing this survey for several years, and the kind of key question that keeps popping up is, who's the best? And I'm sure everyone wants to know at least their answer to this question, because you want to kind of compare it to your own sense. And so I'm curious to see kind of how everybody feels about that. It's odd because most of the time we think about vice presidents as being a bit of an afterthought. So this is why this is such an exciting volume to get a chance to talk about. It's like being the shortest New York Knick, right? Typically you don't think about that as being important, but there's the important constitutional roles and of course an important political role. Our findings basically tell us that there are various tiers of greatness for vice presidents. So we can see that the first tier, and on the screen you can read that it includes several recent vice presidents. Al Gore and Joe Biden are among the top two, followed by Johnson, George H.W. Bush, and Walter Mondale. As Justin said, the policy advisor role of the vice president is a prominent feature in how people consider presidential greatness. So these individuals all had a fairly prominent role in that. The next tier includes vice presidents who also did something that I'll talk about in a second, which is a sizable function of how people consider greatness, and that's that they took over for presidents who were incapacitated or unable to serve. So there you have Gerald Ford and Harry Truman, followed by Hubert Humphrey, Nixon, and Dick Cheney. So again, you're seeing some of those elements play out. The third tier involves vice presidents who either didn't have a big functional role in the White House or had one and maybe didn't do as well at it. So Kamala Harris, Rockefeller, Mike Pence, who obviously had serious objections to the way that the White House in general handled things, especially at the very end, Alvin Barkley, John Nance Gardner, and several others you probably haven't heard of or haven't thought of since your history classes. The very last tier is the disgraced vice president that was ultimately run out of office. And so that is obviously the kind of, not surprising, the tail end of our full survey. So we can see some definite separation there when it comes to the different tiers and how people kind of assess these presidents. At the end of this, what we did was to put this into a statistical model that let us predict what the factors were that people generally included as the estimates that were the most prominent for what made a great vice president. The two that were the most prominent were, number one, the length of service of that person in office. That's not surprising. That's the similar way people think about the presidency, and the other is whether they took over for the president or not. Those are the two most important statistical factors. Some that weren't that important were really interesting to us. So that you came from a swing state didn't really matter. The percentage of the vote you got in that swing state didn't really matter. Whether you won the election next didn't matter much either. So again, we have a small sample size, so it's hard to make definitive estimates about this, but it's a great reminder of two things. Number one, there's a lot of variation in how presidents and vice presidents are treated and how they're thought of. And the second is that we're really at the infancy of studying the vice presidency and really getting into some of these details about the way that they coordinate with the presidents that they serve with, how it is that the politics of that function, and of course, the constitutional role of it. So a lot of great work to be done. This book is a perfect first step towards understanding this in a more dynamic way, and it's been really encouraging to get to read all of it and to see some great work up here. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rottinghouse and Dr. Vaughn. Let me say, too, for the professors, I can share those slides with you if your students would like to have them, because there is a lot there. Now, and I'm glad you brought up, Brandon, that there's lots of work to be done, because that's not only true for us as scholars, but for future students. If you like institutions, this is a really exciting field for future study down the road, and we'll be talking about that. Before we move into discussion, you've probably seen we've spent a lot of time talking about the role of the vice president, how people view vice presidents. We haven't talked about elections or transitions. So the last two chapters that we'll discuss here, I think we'll go chronologically. So we'll start with Professor Devine's chapter on what role, if any, vice presidential candidates play. And then we'll conclude with Professor Brown's analysis of vice presidents-elect during the transfer of power. Please.
Thank you, Professor Bose. And I want to pick up on something that you were just mentioning about how you can do research for students, or of course the faculty as well in the room. But my interest in vice presidential candidates, and I do more of the candidates than actually in office. I think it's interesting too. But my research is on the electoral dynamics. Much of this is done, including this chapter, with Kyle Kopko, who I went to graduate school with at Ohio State. And back when we were students, graduate school in that case, there was a VP pick in 2008, and Sarah Palin was chosen as the Republican nominee. And, that was an interesting candidacy in a lot of different ways. But one thing that caught our attention, we were actually on a road trip together, and we had a lot of time to talk. And this just happened. And people were picking it apart and saying, was this the right pick? And part of what they were saying is, hey, you should have picked someone from a swing state. She's from Alaska. Republicans are going to win Alaska. They only have 3 electoral votes anyway. You should pick someone who can help you deliver a state. And we thought, does anyone know if that's true? I mean, how would you know? And this is the kind of thing, if you're a student listening to this, and maybe it's vice presidents, maybe it's something completely different, and you hear people saying something all the time, and you're just told that's what's true, pause a second and say, how do I know that that's the case? Maybe there are studies out there you'd be interested to read. Okay, good. There's good evidence for that. But if not, maybe you could do that research. Maybe you could even disprove or complicate some conventional wisdom and show people, actually things are a little more complicated than you realize. That's kind of what Kyle Kopko and I have done with our research, and this chapter is a continuation of it. Basically, we're building on this idea that the main reason that you pick someone for vice president is to help win that election. Well, that goes back to a history of constitutional power or lack thereof. If you look to this day in the Constitution itself, there's very little that a vice president actually does. The joke, of course, going back to our previous reference to political humor, is that they sit around and wait for the president to die and take over if that's the case. There are all kinds of vice presidents who made jokes about it all the time. Yeah. So they succeed the president to office if something happens to the president. They preside over the Senate, or at least they used to. They can take the chair if they want to. They could exercise their power significantly, but as Professor Brownell told us, they don't tend to do that a whole lot anymore. They do count the electoral votes when they come in, and usually that's not a thing, but it was in 2021. Kind of forgot they had that power, right? And they break tie votes in the Senate, which Kamala Harris did more as VP than anyone else. That's not a lot of power. Now, over the years, last 50 years, they've gained a larger role in government, mainly because presidents, starting in the 1970s, Gerald Ford, and especially with Jimmy Carter working with Walter Mondale, realized, hey, actually, having a number 2 in office who is going to be a top advisor to me, someone who can really help me govern, is a great asset to the administration. I will be a better president if I use this person who's already there, but instead of just shunting them off to the Senate to go sit around for the day, actually involve them in administration. That could be a really helpful thing. Well, we still have this holdover idea that vice presidents are a joke. and that the only reason to pick them is to help win the election. What we've seen over time is actually a shift, and Professor Baumgartner has done some wonderful research on this with vice presidential selection, in fact, that some of those traditional electoral factors matter less over time. And leadership, governing ability is becoming a bigger factor in selection, not all the time, but generally speaking, that's being valued more. What our research showed, this is a book we had in 2020, Do Running Mates Matter? Which, title's pretty self-explanatory. And we found that a lot of those traditional factors, the hey, pick this person for vice president, and you'll pick up the state they're from or the region they're from. The voters will just automatically follow along. Really? Or you pick up a demographic group or something like that. That doesn't really pan out, generally speaking. For example, everybody knows that Mike Pence delivered white evangelicals in 2016 election. Actually, when you really look at the evidence, it's not clear that he did. Probably those folks were going to come home to the Republican Party no matter who they put up for president. So where do they matter? They matter more as a reflection on the presidential candidate. The fact that you choose someone, as Donald Trump did in that case with Mike Pence, whatever you think of his politics, like him or don't like him, he was a very well-qualified vice president, and that was a very responsible choice by then candidate Trump. And that's the kind of thing where voters then reward the presidential candidate, say, I wasn't sure exactly what your thought process was. That's a good leadership decision. Other times, they pick someone who's not really up for the job. Sarah Palin, we heard about earlier, was a classic example where people were not at all, generally speaking, impressed by her abilities as a potential vice president, and that hurt perceptions of John McCain's judgment. Conversely, when Barack Obama picked Joe Biden for vice president, again, whatever you think of his politics, he was a very experienced vice presidential pick and seemed to add credibility to the ticket. So that's generally what we find is that VP picks matter, not because they deliver states and blocks of voters en masse, but because they could help people think better of the presidential candidate, or worse if you play it wrong. We extended that into 2020 because that book came out in 2020. We couldn't analyze that election at that point. We wanted to see, hey, how did this check out in 2020? Kamala Harris, very significant vice presidential candidate, third woman to run for office, first one to do so successfully, first African-American or Asian-American candidate for the vice presidency. So what effect did that have on voters, particularly appealing to members of those groups? Like, for example, did she help with women voters? Did she help with African-American voters? And the short story is here that she did, but not by a lot. It wasn't like some major decisive advantage that the Biden campaign got among those voters in helping them win the election. She did have a good level of experience, not the most ever vice presidential candidate, but a solid resume. And so probably seen by most voters as a responsible pick in that case. And so, that's another example where we see that the vice presidential pick does tell some people something about the presidential candidate, but don't expect it to be the difference maker in the election. We probably overestimate that. And by the way, when presidential candidates pass over the sexier electoral pick, someone who could, deliver this big result, to pick someone who's just up to the job, I think that's a good thing. And we are seeing more of that in recent years. By and large, I think that's a good trend. Of course, we'll see where things continue into the future because, hey, 2028 isn't that far away, right? We'll have a transition then, right, Heath Brown?
Okay, that excellent transition. Thank you, Heath. Let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm always fearful to follow Chris in a presentation because he seems to remember everything, and I seem to forget everything almost immediately after I write it. So I am humbled to follow and to join the panel and apologize for being stuck somewhat out here in the snow that we have in New Jersey. It's a pleasure to join everyone. I was trying to think back, given my very short memory, to when I believe it was Chris approached me to work on this project. And Mina, as you mentioned, my area of expertise is on presidential transitions. And this has always been a difficult area of expertise because unlike so many of my colleagues here today, I study a very short amount of time, often just like 100 days or so. And so I always marvel at people who collect like hundreds of years of data, and I'm like mining over just a couple of weeks. It feels somewhat unambitious on my part. But it's difficult because the presidential transition period is a very hidden time period. We don't have much archival work in presidential transitions. And so this has always just provided a difficulty in studying the time period, and is in part why there's relatively little scholarship on presidential transitions in comparison to the study of the presidency. So when Chris approached me and said, "How about you, apply some of what you have done to the transitions of vice presidents?" I thought, well, this is even worse. If you thought trying to study, 100 odd days only on occasion is hard for the presidency, try it for the vice presidency. So, but I said I think it's a great idea because I'm really interested in this, and so that's what I worked on, and I did so by trying to apply the typology that Karine developed, and I really want to thank her for that because with that provided the structure for what I worked on, and trying to typologize the vice presidential transition period ultimately, and the short answer is that ultimately works very well. And I think the biggest takeaway from what I worked on is that the transition period, not unlike the campaign, foreshadows a lot about the role that the vice president is going to take once in office. I'm just going to share some very, very brief comments here so we can move on to the question and answer portion of this. And I wanted to take, this statement that's been made a couple times about the vice presidency as being kind of a joke. And I was trying to think about what was the funniest part of the chapter that I wrote, if anything. And so I started looking around real quickly here, and I realized there were actually a couple of very funny things. And to the surprise of probably nobody, the funniest thing would be attributed to Vice President Quayle. Surprise, surprise. And so somebody came to him at some point, about a decade after he left office, that is, left the vice presidency, and they asked him about his role during the transition period when he was elected with George Bush. And what he said I thought was so revealing. He said, and I actually think it's very funny as well, he said, "My transition into the vice presidency was very, very easy." There aren't too many aspects of national politics where they describe it as very, very easy. He continued, he said, "Bush had been vice president. He knew exactly what I needed. So all of that was fairly simple." It's a good description of the role of bystander that vice presidents play. Dan Quayle was readily admitted that his role during that transition, for a number of reasons, was very much at the periphery. He wasn't the only bystander during this time period. In fact, George Bush played that role almost identically when he was elected vice president. When somebody approached him, an interviewer, and asked him about the role that he played during the 1980-81 transition of Ronald Reagan, he said, to the question about his role, he said, "Transition, the role I played was almost none." And so I think that's a good kind of way in which we can think about what vice presidents typically play. But of course, this isn't the only thing that has gone on, and we have seen evolution in the role that vice presidents have played during transitions. The most active, again, not surprisingly, was Vice President Cheney. The scholar Joel Goldstein described the role that Vice President Cheney played during that transition in 2001 as unprecedented. And I think this is an accurate way to describe the role that Cheney played, being really the last word on numerous, maybe a majority or almost all of the important personnel decisions, policy decisions, decisions about the White House made during that transition period. No vice president prior to this and no vice president following has played such a leadership role during the transition period. This clearly foreshadowed the very active role he played once the White House was stood up and the inauguration has happened. Oftentimes, though not perfectly so, the transition period, though it's hard to see, is a good predictor of the role that the vice president is going to play for the following 4 years. I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Heath, and thank you for those examples, which raise so much for further discussion. I think we have a little bit of time for our panel discussion, and then we want to make sure we have time for student questions. So why don't you, all of you, particularly the three classes, start thinking about questions. We will have to ask you to come up to the mic because we need to have that for the recording. But while you do that, while you're thinking about what cases or topics are of interest, I think we'll turn it over to the volume co-editors, because I think you had some quick questions for our group, starting with bringing this up to the present. I'm correct?
Corinne, do you want to take the first question?
Oh, no, you can go.
Okay.
I'll take the second.
Okay, great. So, to our panelists, and we had some who expressed particular interest in answering this first question, so we'll see. By the way, we're trying not to do the same old boring. Are vice presidents important or something like that? All right, so we're going a little out of the box here. Here's your question. You ready? Your chapters were written before J.D. Vance became vice president. If you could add a postscript on his role as a candidate or as vice president, what would you say? How does his performance confirm or complicate your research findings about running mates or vice presidents? I think Jody and Justin had expressed interest in that. You want to kick it off?
So, sure. I'm not really sure what to say about Vance, about what Late Night Comics said about Vance. I have to confess, it's hard for me to follow late night comedy anymore because it's all late night satire, and I don't find it nearly as funny as I did 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Having said that, I'm not sure any clear caricature has emerged other than just Vance is a sort of sycophantic Trump lackey at this point, which sharply differs, right? It's either implicit or explicit, which sharply differs from where he might have been, what, 6 or 8 years ago, right? I'm more capable of talking about a caricature of Vice President Harris, with the caveat that it didn't really fully emerge or crystallize until she ran for president. As I may have mentioned earlier, the late night comics largely ignored her. I think for probably, well, I'm not going to get into why. You can ask me individually afterwards if you're interested. But once she started running for president, as I said, some of the conservative satire places like the Babylon Bee started going all out at her and her running mate, Tim Walz. As I may have mentioned, she was accused of being a word salad machine, kind of in a similar way that Biden was, except different, like just completely nonsensical stuff. They also went after Tim Walz, the moniker that conservative critics slapped on him, Tampon Tim, for his advocacy of putting feminine hygiene products in both bathrooms in Minnesota, sort of transmuted itself into Tampon Tim, and the Babylon Bee went all out on it. There was a good 4 or 5 or 6 throughout really, we're measuring like a 2-month period of time of say 2 to 4 or 5 stories a day. One of them I remember being the local people, the kids in his neighborhood, completely dissatisfied with trick-or-treating in his house because he was just giving out tampons. It's just a complete nonsensical stuff, but it's satire, right? So I kind of wish I was able to do that, but in reality, I'm not sure either of those would have fit because, again, the caricature of Harris doesn't really emerge and crystallize until she's running for president. The same thing kind of happened with the Gore thing as well, just for the record. But if I talked about Tim Walz, I'd have to talk about Sarah Palin, which I would have loved to do, by the way, but that wasn't my mandate, so.
Okay.
So that's a great question, and how do I answer it? So as we saw in our research, the two most important things for a president to be a vice president to be great or effective or impactful is for their ability to be an advisor to the president and to serve as a proxy for the president. But I think the thing that we maybe none of us really directly addressed yet this afternoon is that the most important determinant of how impactful a vice president is going to be is whether or not the president allows them to be. And the relationship with the president is key, dominates everything. And so from the perspective of the president that J.D. Vance serves, I think he's probably fulfilling at least one of those roles pretty well, which is the surrogate or proxy role. President Trump has long been known for wanting to see his advocates on television being aggressive and aggressively defending him, defending his administration, defending their positions. And J.D. Vance does that every single day, very assertively. And President Trump is quite, by all media coverage, is quite happy with Vance's approach to doing that. The extent to which Vance is a policy advisor is not terribly clear to me. A lot of the issues that have taken up the administration so far have really been more relevant to other people's purview, right? Marco Rubio, who is nominally, maybe not so nominally, a rival for Vance for the 2028 nomination. Marco Rubio has certainly had more opportunities to be a policy advisor. Folks who have the kind of international negotiation portfolio, folks who have immigration in their portfolio, have had more opportunities to be policy advisors than Vance. But Vance is probably, I don't know, without peer, I think, in terms of the person who goes on TV and advocates for the presidency the way that President Trump likes to see it. And so, to that extent, I think he's been effective for his most important audience, which is, as people like to say about the folks who work for President Trump, an audience of one. And I'll say that, strategically, that's not unwise for Vance, because if Vance is ambitious, and everybody in this particular game is ambitious, and he wants to be president of the United States, he has to win the Republican primary, which in order to do that means he has to win over one person's loyalty, and that's Donald Trump. And without Trump's support, there's not any likelihood that Vance becomes the next GOP nominee. And so his ability to position himself for 2028 is completely tied to his ability to be Trump's surrogate in a way that Trump wants him to be. And so far, I think he's performing that task as effectively as one might hope to.
Thank you. Before we move on, I'm going to just turn to Heath and Corinne in a minute to see if you have any comments on Vice President Vance and applying your research there. I should say that the comments that both Professors Vaughn and Baumgartner have made, I think, point to, and earlier comments about how either commentary about a vice president, right, or the actions a vice president takes, their role in a presidency, affects their prospects, the prospects for future campaigns. And I should have said, actually, vice presidents and vice presidential candidates, which I think, Jody, is what you were referring to when you said your chapter focused on vice presidents, not candidates, or you would have addressed Sarah Palin as well. But I think it's important for us to think about that Governor Walz, for example, of Minnesota, his political career, I think, has been kind of changed significantly from the vice presidential run, and not in a way that I think would have been anticipated when that campaign began, as far as kind of prospects in 2028 and beyond. But I want to see Heath and Corinne, if you want to comment on the current vice presidency and your case studies and your analysis.
I can say a few words. As for me, Vance's performance makes my research a little bit more complicated, because on the one hand, he plays a much more active role than I expected. And on the other, he's a rather unusual vice president in a very unusual administration led by an unusual president. So for now, it's hard for me to tell whether he represents a logical continuation of his predecessor, the starting point of a new type of vice presidency, or simply an exception on his own. In any case, I believe that this in itself justifies further research into the vice presidency. So, but I'm agreeing with everything the other panelists said about it. So,
okay, thank you. Heath, I'm assuming if you're not unmuting that you're not going to comment.
I'd be glad to unmute for a second. I think that
I can't tell from here. Go ahead, please.
That's all right. I think that though we know very little about what happened during this latest transition for a lot of reasons. I think there's clear evidence that then Vice President-elect Vance was very instrumental in what was maybe the most significant aspect of that transition and the early days of the Trump administration, which was the standing up of the DOJ office. I think without Vice President Vance, the invitation to Elon Musk to participate in such a significant way in the operations of the early days of the Trump administration wouldn't have happened. I think he is the linkage to Mr. Musk. I think that the choice of Mr. Vance was tied to the influence of Mr. Musk, and I think the two of them working in partnership is why the DOJ accomplishments, for whatever value they had, can be directly tied to that work during the transition period and the partnership between those two men.
Thank you, Heath. I think there's a lot there that hopefully we'll get a chance to follow up on in the Q&A in a moment. But before we do that, I think Professor Permont is going to ask a question of the panelists, and I think Reb and Brandon were going to respond. Yeah.
This book covers a lot of ground with 12 chapters on modern vice presidents and running mates. Suppose we had the time and space to add one more chapter, either by you or by anybody else. What would it be? In other words, what's missing in this book?
Well, I don't know if I would characterize it as what's missing, but I think that a potential postscript, I've been working on research that's been drawing from a lot of the strains from a lot of the work of colleagues up here. Christoph's chapter, who's not here actually, but his chapter about the President of the Senate. I think Justin and Brandon's work about the way that political scientists and historians view the vice presidency. I think a lot of Corinne's work on partnerships. I think Richard Jan's piece about the last person being involved, the vice president being the last person in the room for vice presidential or for national security decision making. And let me caveat by saying all of them may violently disagree with this thesis, but it seems to me that the modern vice president basically began with Walter Mondale. It's been coming forward for about 50 years now. But it seems, at least to me, that in the last decade or so, that the vice presidency has sort of been in a decline. I think that the formal aspects of the Mondale model, which involve access to presidential papers, a White House office, basically being able to sort of have, some degree of access to the president regularly, that those formalities have remained in place over the entirety of the Mondale model. It just seems in the last 10 years, as an informal matter, that the vice president's status, achievements, and influence over policy have been in decline. And I think that while, again, these individual researchers may disagree with that thesis, at least from my interpretation, it seems that there are elements of their research that they've uncovered that seem to point in that direction. I've done some research as well about, in media hits, how often you see references to someone being the most powerful, most influential, the best vice president ever, which for a long time is sort of a ritualistic thing you'd see at the beginning or in the first year or two of a vice presidency. You see a tail off over the last several years of references to that. And I think that's partly because Cheney was so influential. I don't think there's any question he was the most powerful and influential. But even since then, you see a tail off after the Biden administration with both Pence and Harris. I think the jury's still out on the Vance vice presidency, but I think there's a lot of indicia that indicate that he may not have a lot of influence given what was leaked in the Signals leak chat, when you see other references to sort of his influence and the fact he has very much sort of an isolationist bent to his foreign policy, and you see a quite interventionist presidency so far with Trump. Again, you can't come to a conclusive decision on him until obviously his vice presidency is completed and you have access to records like we're beginning to have with Pence and Harris. But it would seem to me that certainly with Pence and Harris, and I think also potentially with Vance as well, you see about a 10-year decline in the vice presidency. Again, my colleagues may disagree, but their research, I think, in many ways kind of has some elements of that could be tied together in that fashion.
Kind of gets to the cycles of presidential history, actually, too, for the vice presidency. Thank you. Yeah, Brandon.
I'm interested in the kind of more expansive role of the vice presidency, which I think we've seen the last few years. So, what are the intangible elements of the vice presidency that are a little bit hard to quantify? So, Joe Biden famously, after the president signed the Obamacare bill, said this is a big effing deal that became like really the story beyond even the signage of this important legislation. You've got Mike Pence with the fly on his head during the debate, right? Even J.D. Vance has been very memed, right? You see him looking like a garbage pail kid, kind of puffy with the hair and dancing around. He dressed up like this character for Halloween to kind of self-own this. There's a lot of this now on the vice presidency that there never was before. So I'm wondering kind of how those things affect the perception of the vice president and how we generally see the vice presidency changing as a result of these kind of informal roles that the vice president plays, almost as like, you know, not even a second fiddle to the president, but like a kind of, you know, partner in a kind of a new media world. So I'm curious about how those things all kind of interact, and everybody's work in this volume really connects to some of these different questions that I think is really interesting to see. And it's a welcome moment because we are witnessing the kind of resurgence of this discussion about the vice presidency. Not always good, not always bad, but always there. And so I'm wondering how those things all kind of might flow into this new moment.
Yes, please, Jim.
Yeah, I was just thinking when Reb was talking, it's too bad I wasn't writing the paper that I'm writing right now a couple of years ago when they were when you guys were looking for chapters, because it's an examination. Really briefly, an examination of disaster response stuff by vice presidents from Quayle through Harris. And one of the central themes that's emerging, which really does get to what Reb was talking about, we've been assuming, vice presidential scholars have been assuming for the past however long, 20 plus, 30 plus years, that the growth in vice presidential, if you want to call it power, if you want to call it influence, however you want to talk about it, is kind of linear, but it's clearly not at this point. And one of the central themes that I'd explore more is that intangible stuff of the relationship between the president and the vice president, right? We know Clinton and Gore, until the Monica Lewinsky thing broke anyways, were simpatico policy-wise and personality-wise. We know that Bush was very much, his views were very congruent with Cheney's, at least until the second term. We know that Biden and Obama had very good personal relationship. But that matters with respect to how much power the president is letting the vice president take. To me, that's an interesting story.
Thank you. I have so many questions that I want to ask, but I think we want to at least give some time for the audience to see what you'd like to bring up. Could I ask, because I know we have 3 classes here, if any students from Dr. Feldman's American Politics class or Dr. Miller's writing class or my public policy class, if you'd like to come up, please do. Or if you're a student from another class too, I just know that these 3 classes are here. It could be about a specific case study that we've been discussing. Please, Maisa, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Maisa. I'm a political science and public policy student here, also from Houston, Texas. My question is for Dr. Vaughn and Rottinghaus. I wanted to ask about the focus of your survey questions. Now, whenever you're sending these out, I'm curious, is the lens towards constituents, scholars, officials? How do you kind of get that perception of the vice presidency without targeting all types of individuals?
You're first going to have to tell me how to walk in snow. You must have figured it out by now. I'll just briefly suggest that this is really a survey of scholars, people who we identified as being kind of presidency scholars. So typically that's the universe we've employed for these. The audience is broad in the sense that we want to explain how scholars think about presidential greatness and vice presidential greatness. So we have kind of a, it's a niche kind of element. It's not dissimilar to the way other people have looked at the similar kinds of questions, like C-SPAN does something very similar. For a long time, historians had done this, and so we kind of have a slightly different twist on it, which is to look at how political scientists view it, which does have some differences with how historians view it for some interesting reasons. So we do, kind of have a fairly niche question of the people who we think are kind of experts in this and would have some understanding of it. But even in that, there are a lot of people who don't know a lot about all these presidents, right? We're presidency scholars, but we don't know about, every single president. The same is true for vice presidents too. We can model a little bit of that uncertainty, but there are still just a lot of figures, and history is very long, so people can't know everything about all of these things. But generally speaking, we think these are the folks who know more about how these things work than others. And it's in contrast to, say, like a survey that you might do of presidential greatness, which I just saw a couple of weeks ago from Gallup or something. They'll ask who the best presidents are. So those kinds of surveys come up too, but it's of the general public. So we should expect to see some differences, and those differences are really interesting. So Justin, you want to chime in?
Yeah, only thing I'll add to that is that we often will get the suggestion or criticism of, well, what about looking at regular voters or regular people? And we haven't done that yet, A, because it costs money, and B, as the Gallup poll that Dr. Rottinghouse indicated, or mentioned indicated, most everyday people don't know a lot about a lot of presidents, and so the survey results are usually pretty predictable, right? The guys on Mount Rushmore are up there, and then the Republicans like the most recent Republican, the Democrats like the most recent Democrat, and after that, that's about it, right? You can't really expect, random voter to have strong opinions about Millard Fillmore or Chester Arthur, right? And so I don't think we find much utility in the idea of doing a public survey, but rather, especially when, as Dr. Rottinghouse acknowledged, so many presidency scholars don't know a lot, admit they don't know a lot, which for a college professor is rare. About many of the particularly like 19th century presidents.
Thank you.
And you can add a factor of some number on top of that for vice presidents.
Yeah.
Right? There are plenty of Americans who cannot name the current vice president, can't even name him. So, and that's not, I'm not making any comment on the state of public knowledge or anything like that, but it would make it a little bit challenging to get something meaningful from a survey about that.
Makes it very hard to get the data, right? Yeah, when people know. Corinne and Heath, just so you know, I can't tell if you're trying to say something, so you're going to have to just kind of speak up if you want, okay? All right, thank you. Are there other people who have questions? Because I have one that I'm going to ask, but I don't want to take away a space from a student or anyone else in the audience. No? All right. So we have spent so much time in this panel talking about the partnership between the president and the vice president, and very much with the president as kind of the engine of that partnership, which makes sense given the role. But I'm thinking about Dick Cheney was very unusual. Not only was he the most powerful vice president, he also made it very clear that he had no intention of running for president, right? I mean, he briefly considered it in the 90s, but not after he was Secretary of Defense, but not when he was nominated and became was elected vice president. So I'm wondering, for a vice president who, at the very least, may be mulling a presidential run at some point, I think it was pretty clear that Joe Biden as vice president, wasn't holding that out. Maybe the public didn't see it that way, but kind of thought that would be a possibility. And certainly, I think as you look at Harris, Pence, Harris, Vance, it's pretty clear, right, that this is something that they saw as a possibility. Is there any way that vice presidents can position themselves in a presidency to strengthen their prospects, or are they really dependent on the person, the occupant of the Oval Office?
Well, I think that they're very dependent on the president, certainly. I think at some point, for a vice president to position themselves, they probably need to think that they are going to need to separate themselves a little bit from the president to some degree. You've seen this with a number of two-term vice presidents who have then run to succeed their chief executive. So, for example, I've talked about vice presidential independence. I was talking about checks and balances, but there's a long tradition of vice presidents breaking from presidents on more sort of mundane garden variety issues. So, for example, after the 22nd Amendment, Richard Nixon ran for president. He, by and large, was, all for Ike and stood by Ike, but he still broke with Eisenhower in the last year or two of his presidency on matters of infrastructure, on matters of tax policy, and I believe a national security issue as well. You see this toward the tail end of the Reagan-Bush years, when Bush breaks with President Reagan on the question of Manuel Noriega, who was a sort of a drug dealer at the time. Drug issues were a huge deal, and Bush broke with Reagan on a really, really sensitive issue. He was politically vulnerable on it. You see this with Gore after his 2 terms with Clinton, where he breaks with Clinton on Monica Lewinsky. There was a controversy some of you may remember about Elian Gonzalez, who was a Cuban American who was basically saved in Cuba. There's controversy about whether or not he should be sent back to Cuba. It was a huge issue among certain pockets of the population in Florida. Gore broke with the Clinton administration policy on that. He also broke with on the Lewinsky scandal, criticized the president. I think the contrast is with Kamala Harris. One of the problems that she ran into is that she did not try to separate herself to some degree from Biden. It's an awkward position to be in, but particularly if the president's unpopular generally, as Biden was, it really can be costly. So, the vice president may want to kind of wink and kind of work it out in advance with the president, like, hey, I'm going to have to break with you on some things, or the relationship is just good enough to withstand it, and the president at the time, who's the outgoing president, may just be pragmatic enough to be like, hey, if I want my legacy to be preserved, I need to kind of put up with a little bit of criticism from the outgoing vice president. But to me, I think that's important, even in a successful president or popular presidency, such as Eisenhower, Reagan, Clinton. Those were all very popular presidents when they were outgoing, but vice president still needs to establish their own standing if they're going to run again, in my own opinion.
Thank you. Please.
Well, and while the vice president should avoid line assignments, those meaningless, reinventing government, for example, in the case of Gore, for the vice president to be able to carve out a policy niche or become known as being a policy person, Gore with climate, Gore with technology, Biden with the Judiciary Committee, for example, or Foreign Affairs, I think that's useful as well, on top of or in addition to or to augment what Reb was saying.
I'd like to add to it, but first, Heath or Karine, can I give you an opportunity to answer if you want to, or pass? Okay. I'm thinking historically about this as we prepare for what's the likely possibility, as we've spoken to, that J.D. Vance will run for president in 2028, and that he will have to do this complicated dance, as Professor Brownell was just speaking to, of trying to establish some kind of independence, some kind of distance, running as his own person, while still staying reasonably loyal and maintaining some kind of support from Donald Trump. If we look back at past examples where an incumbent vice president, a sitting vice president, is at the same time running for the presidency in recent years, we don't have a lot of that, but we have Al Gore struggling with that under Bill Clinton, separating himself to the point where there's a really good political science study on this, suggesting that if he had not distanced himself so much from Bill Clinton and just claimed more credit for the Clinton-Gore economy, which was going really well, he might have actually benefited more from it and won in that very close election in 2000. Or we think of, I'm trying to remember. Yes, thank you. Hubert Humphrey in 1968, Lyndon Johnson's vice president. Johnson actually was rooting for Richard Nixon in that election, actively working against his own vice president at that time. We just don't have a history of this going well. Probably the smoothest one is in 1988 when George H.W. Bush is the sitting vice president. But as Richard Yon, his wonderful book, Emerging from the Shadows, which I recommend to you all, recent book, details that Bush was so deferential, he had to be just pulled along to finally do any kind of separation from Reagan, and never did very much. So the only time it's gone smoothly is when they attempt so little separation, it almost doesn't matter to the sitting president. Now, the complicated dynamic for J.D. Vance, look, any of these historical examples, no president likes the vice president separating establishing some distance. It's just gone poorly every time that's really been tried. And here we have a situation we know with President Trump that he values loyalty in a way that many presidents have. But I think to a greater degree, he doesn't just want, you can't disagree with me, but you have to aggressively champion it. You know, as Justin was speaking to a bit there, you know, I think of it as this idea of always being on offense. You know, always being like the biggest cheerleader. I think that's how he got chosen as the running mate, was demonstrating repeatedly that he would go farther than anybody in speaking up for Donald Trump, no matter what he was advocating in terms of policy or what he was saying rhetorically. That doesn't create an environment where there's space to separate yourself. For that matter, I don't think we've seen any evidence that Donald Trump really is capable of giving up the spotlight. You know, he is someone who really wants to be the center of attention. I don't think he's going to react well, no matter who it is, to ceding that role and saying, I was your party leader, now I'm stepping aside, this is your new leader. I don't know how that process will go, but I don't think it'll go smoothly or well. And for that reason, while I think J.D. Vance is clearly the front runner in 2028, if I had to bet money, don't bet money, but if I had to, I put it on him. But with that said, if there was a problem in that relationship that involved any distance whatsoever from Donald Trump, I wouldn't rule it out that you could see Donald Trump kind of turning on J.D. Vance and actually supporting someone else instead.
With that, I think we've learned a lot from this discussion, and I think the kind of concluding lesson I would bring here is that second in command as vice president does not necessarily set up a vice president for success in a White House campaign, at least not immediately after a vice presidency. And that's why only Martin Van Buren and George H.W. Bush went directly from vice president to president. But we've seen many people do it with a little bit of space in between. Please join me in thanking our panelists on Zoom and here for this very instructive discussion.